All right. Today we are diving into a truly wild piece of history. The story of how a private corporation, the British East India Company, literally transformed from a bunch of traders into the rulers of the entire Indian subcontinent. I mean, really think about that question for a second. It sounds like something from a sci-fi movie, doesn't it? How does a for-profit business with shareholders and a board of directors in London end up with its own army, collecting taxes, and governing millions of people? Well, that's exactly the story we're going to unpack. So, to get our heads around this, we've got to rewind way back. Because for the longest time, the East India Company had zero interest in conquering anything. Their one and only goal? It was much, much simpler: profit. Okay, now look at these dates, 1612 and 1757. That is a huge gap, right? We're talking more than 140 years. For 5 generations, they were just merchants, buying spices and textiles and shipping them back to Britain. They were not masters, they were merchants. So what changed? What flipped the switch? Well, it wasn't really about the company at first. It was about what was happening in India. The mighty Mughal Empire, which had held the subcontinent together for centuries, started to weaken, to fracture. And when an empire falls apart, it leaves behind a massive power vacuum. And guess who was sitting right there with tons of cash, its own private army, and endless ambition? Yep, the company. Now, this wasn't some slow, accidental drift into power. No way. They were very specific, calculated moments that turned this trading company into something like a sovereign state. Let's look at the 2 events that really changed the game. First up, you've got the Battle of Plassey. This is the big one most people point to. The company's man on the ground, Robert Clive, defeated the local ruler, the Nawab of Bengal. But here's the kicker. He didn't do it with some massive heroic army. He won because he cut a deal with local financiers who wanted the Nawab out of the picture. It was basically a hostile takeover with cannons. But, winning a battle is one thing. Actually becoming the government, that's a whole other level. The real turning point, the moment the company went from just being a powerful player to being the power, came 8 years later with a little something called the Diwani. This one document changed absolutely everything.
So what on earth is a Diwani? It's simple and it's brilliant in a pretty ruthless kind of way. It was the right granted by the weak Mughal emperor for a private British company to collect all the taxes from India's richest provinces. In an instant, the East India Company had the revenue stream of a nation. They didn't have to just trade anymore. They could tax. And this new power, a corporation ruling for profit, had immediate and devastating consequences for the people of Bengal. See, the focus was never on good governance, it was on extraction. It was all about the bottom line. Just look at this number, 10 million. That is the estimated number of people who died in the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. This was just 5 years after the company took control of the taxes. We're talking about 1/3 of the entire population gone. And it's so important to understand this wasn't just a natural disaster. Oh no. The company's policies took a bad situation and turned it into an absolute catastrophe. Even while people were starving, the company kept demanding its taxes, business as usual. And worse, they had monopolies on things like grain, so they controlled the food supply, keeping prices high to protect their profits. Beyond the famine, the company's rule began to fundamentally re-engineer Indian society. They brought in these totally alien British ideas about private land ownership, which completely upended centuries of tradition. And they built a new system, a harsh one, based on a new racial hierarchy. So, as you can imagine, for the next 100 years or so, all this resentment just simmered. The disruptions weren't just economic anymore. They were political, social, and cultural. You had a collision of 2 completely different worlds, and it was getting ready to explode. This table here breaks down that building pressure perfectly. You had a political clash between 2 completely different systems. Economically, cheap goods from Britain's factories were destroying the livelihoods of local weavers and artisans. Socially, British reforms were seen by many as a direct attack on their culture and religion. And all of this tension was reflected inside the company's own army, among the Indian soldiers known as sepoys. And then, in 1857, after 100 years of company rule, that simmering resentment finally boiled over. A massive, violent uprising just swept across northern India like a wildfire. And the spark that lit this huge powder keg? You won't believe it.
It was a rifle cartridge. A rumor spread that the new cartridges, which the soldiers had to bite open with their teeth, were greased with cow and pig fat. For Hindu and Muslim soldiers, this was a profound religious insult, and that was the final straw.
The violence was immediate, and it was brutal. This quote from an eyewitness really captures the chaos of it all. One blaze of fire as the symbols of company rule were just systematically destroyed by the rebels. So while the cartridge was the spark, the revolt itself was a huge explosion of all those grievances we just talked about. This became a war that united peasants, nobles, and soldiers all against their corporate ruler. But despite its massive scale, the rebellion was brutally suppressed by the British within about a year. But the revolt had a monumental consequence. It absolutely terrified the British government. They decided that letting a private company rule a subcontinent was just too dangerous, too unstable. So, in 1858, the East India Company was dissolved. Its territories were all transferred directly to the British Crown, officially beginning the period we know as the British Raj. And that leaves us with a final crucial question. The company was gone, but the system it built, a system of economic extraction, of military control, of deep social division, all of that remained. The corporate state was just replaced by a formal empire. So what did it mean for India to inherit the legacy of those 100 years that came before?